The late 1970s and early 1980s were home to a period known as the Golden Age of arcade gaming. The era saw the graphics, power, gameplay, and especially revenue of arcade machines expand at incredible speeds, helping catapult video games from a curiosity to an all-out phenomenon. However, this golden age wasn't confined to just the arcades themselves. During this period, a majority of home console games featured simple high-score based gameplay similar to arcade games. As such, it was a no-brainer for arcade companies to make conversions of their own games for these consoles, the most popular of which by far was the Atari 2600. Released in 1977 as the Atari VCS, the system was intended to only last a few years before a more powerful replacement came along, and as such several design decisions were made to keep production costs down. One of the most consequential of these was the choice to not feature a frame buffer in order to save on RAM. Instead, the VCS used a device known as the television interface adapter to generate graphics as each line was scanned. As a result of this, the console was limited in the objects it could display, with only 2 detailed player sprites, 2 simple missile sprites, a ball spanning a single pixel, and a background able to be on screen at once. Due to these technical limitations, porting arcade games onto the system was a tall order, and no port better exemplified these issues than Pac-Man, released on the Atari 2600 in 1982. To display ghosts, one of the 2 player sprites shows a different ghost each frame, providing the illusion of all 4 ghosts being on screen at once. Unfortunately, there were still a number of drawbacks to this method. First, the flickering is extremely noticeable even on older TVs and makes the game difficult to play for long periods of time due to eye strain. Along with this, there's no visual distinction between the ghosts due to the player sprites only being able to use a single color at a time. The issues don't stop there, though. The sound effects are harsh, Pac-Man always faces to one side, but the most baffling discrepancy is the colors used. The arcade game featured a black background, but Atari had a mandate in place at the time allowing only space-themed games to use the color. Instead, the background in 2600 Pac-Man is blue, meaning that the walls of the maze also had to be changed in order to contrast with it. While Pac-Man on the Atari 2600 was a massive commercial success, selling more than 7 million copies in 1982 alone, there was something lacking to it. Although the game was an adequate port in the eyes of most, few ever considered it anything more than that due to its myriad of problems. However, it wasn't the only Pac-Man game ported to the console. That same year, the arcade game received a sequel in Miss Pac-Man, published by North American distributor Bally Midway and developed by General Computer Corporation. Miss Pac-Man wasn't revolutionary when compared to the original, rather, it took its predecessor's formula and improved upon it in a number of different areas. One of the best examples of this is how while Pac-Man used the same maze for the entire game, Miss Pac-Man features 4 layouts that alternate based on the stage number. Fruit now travels from one end of the screen to the other as opposed to appearing in the center of the maze, and a degree of randomness has been added to the Ghost's AI in order to add an extra degree of challenge. The game was ported to the Atari 2600 in 1983, and while it didn't achieve anywhere near the sales of the original port, it was much closer to the original arcade experience. The biggest difference here is how the graphics work. First, instead of cycling between 4 ghosts, Miss Pac-Man was able to display 2 ghosts at once by switching the position of the second player sprite as the frame itself was rendering. By only needing to alternate between 2 frames in order to display all the ghosts, the flickering that plagued the original is no longer a serious issue here. On top of being easier on the eyes, by changing the shade of the player sprite as it switches position, each ghost is also a distinct color, as was the case in the arcade version. The moving fruit is another feature carried over from the arcade, making use of the missile sprites. To facilitate this, the power pellets that previously utilized these were changed to become part of the background, similar to how the normal pellets were displayed in the first game. Along with this, the background itself has also been changed to work more like it did in the arcade game with 4 different mazes in total. Based on these improvements and new features, it would be reasonable to assume that Mrs. Pac-Man for the Atari 2600 is a better game than the original in every way. Unfortunately, it's not that simple. Due to the different layouts of arcade machines and televisions at the time, both games look off compared to their original versions, with the aspect ratio of their respective displays being almost inverse of one another. With Pac-Man, there's a simple workaround to this. Due to the warp tubes having been moved from the sides to the top and bottom of the display, you can recreate the original layout by simply rotating your screen. However, in Miss Pac-Man on the 2600, the warp tubes remain on the sides of the screen. While the game can still be rotated to provide a similar layout to the original, it's just not the same. Also, the background's still the wrong color!